We makers all have that dream project, the one we'll get to as soon as we have the skills to make the pattern, or when we find the perfect fabric. Well, I've been looking for the perfect lush green silk velvet within my budget for about 3 years. And you know what? I'm done. I'm making my dream project out of whatever material I have available. Right now, that's a pile of used undershirts. Sure, I can work with that. There is one thing I'm not willing to compromise on. Color. Here we have a bit of a dilemma. I have dyed many different things, many different colors in my day, but I've never dyed anything green. It turns out there are a lot of different options for green dye. Obviously, we're gonna have to experiment a little bit and figure out which of these green dyes works best for my project. We wouldn't be able to test out every green dye because we'd be here for a whole year, but I have kind of narrowed it down to 5 options that I think are probably the most readily available to most people. And I've broken this down into 2 categories. Natural, which is like plants and insects and minerals and natural things, and chemical dyes, which are like those ready-to-go dye packets that you can buy in most craft stores. We'll start out with natural, which seems like it should be fairly straightforward because there's a lot of green in nature. However, the book that I usually consult for all of my natural dyeing needs does not have a green recipe. Google informs me that there are several plant varieties that do produce a nice rich green dye. Not the easiest things to source, it turns out. It's just chlorophyll that makes green dye, and chlorophyll is in all green plants. Therefore, any green plant should make at least a little bit of green dye. So I'm gonna try out several plant varieties that I do have around, and we'll see what we get. Okay, here is my somewhat feral at the moment garden. I collect seeds, so almost everything has gone to flower or seed at the moment, which means we have plenty of material to dye with. This abundant fellow is parsley. I also have kale, beets, arugula, carrots, peas, rosemary, cilantro, tomatoes, and several varieties of squash. A lot of those are fairly close in color, so I think they'll probably produce similar dyes. I'll start with parsley since there's so much of it. I know with other plant matter you need about 4 cups to dye 100 grams of fabric. I'm only dyeing small swatches for now, so I think I'll need about 2 cups. I think kale should make a darker green, so let's try some of that. Those are the 2 shade extremes of the garden, but I've also heard grass makes a good dye. I don't have a lawn, but I have a lot of grass that has crept into our yard from somewhere. So let's just pick some of that. Free dye, why not, right? Okay, first I'll prepare the 3 dye baths because those need to sit overnight, and then I'll prepare the fabric because that also needs to be prepared overnight. To help the chlorophyll out of the veg and into the water, I chopped up the veg. If I were fancier, I'd have put this in a food processor, but I'm not. I added 2 cups of each veg and 4 cups of water to 3 normal cooking pots. I allowed the veg to simmer for about 2 hours. Okay, so while the veg is cooking, let's start the process of preparing the fabric. Natural dyeing is a process, and you kind of just need to accept that going in. This process will vary a lot depending on what fiber you're dyeing. I'm dyeing cotton or plant-based cellulose, but the process would be slightly different if I were using animal or protein fiber like silk or wool. I wouldn't recommend natural dyeing for man-made fibers like poly, by the way. I've just found it doesn't stick as well. The first thing I need to do is scour or wash the fabric. The entire textile/garment production process is full of wet processing. Essentially every single stage gets its own set of sizing or finishing processes. The yarn is coated with starch or stabilizer to make it easier to weave or knit. Then that stabilizer needs to be removed before the fabric is dyed because it hinders the dye process, etc. It's actually super harmful to the environment and communities where wet processing takes place, but this is our industry. For the experiment portion of this, I'll only be dyeing small test swatches, but the total amount of fabric I have to dye is 8 shirts. Some of the dyes I'll be testing don't need all this prep, but it won't hurt anything, so I'll prep all the fabric at once so that I'm ready to go with whatever dye I do choose in the end. I am actually dyeing a bunch of old t-shirts, and they're well used, so they likely don't have any finishing agents left on them, but they may have detergent or something lingering. I'll be using soda ash to scour these. This step needs a lot of heat, so you can do this stovetop, but I've had good luck with washing machine scouring, and it is much easier, so that is where I'm headed next. I used the hottest water option on my machine. Besides using a lot of water, this process involves a lot of heating water. I added 1/4 cup soda ash right to the wash cycle like regular detergent. I added the shirts right into the tank and washed away. So, do you know that episode of Friends where Rachel Green, so ironic, throws a red sock in with her whites and everything comes out like this beautiful, even shade of like baby pink? Every time I watch that, I'm like, that would never happen. So, as a lot of you probably know, I do a ton of thrifting. I like to get things from the clearance center at Goodwill, like literally as they're about to be like shipped off to landfill or incineration or shipped overseas or whatever. And I clean, mend, overdyed, stained items. A couple of days ago, I overdyed this dress red because it had a stain on it. A funny story about soda ash, it is good as a scouring agent, but it's also a dye fixative. So I guess there was some red residue left in the washer, and now all of my lovely white shirts are pink. So tip of the day, after you rinse out or wash your dyed items, do a nice tank cleanse on your washing machine. I still have one white shirt left, so I'm going to take my one white shirt that I didn't wash. I'm going to clean my tank, wash that one white shirt, and I'm going to dye one test piece of this pink fabric and one test piece of the white shirt. I have a feeling that this pink is not going to affect the color of the dye that much. For scientific purposes, we'll still have the white clean piece to compare different dyes to. Like, I've pieced together how this happened, but I'm still having a hard time accepting that in my brain. Next, the test fabric needed a mordant bath. A mordant, which again will be different for different fibers, helps to open up the fiber and make it the correct pH for dyeing. I used aluminum acetate as my mordant, and as this is a proper chemical and this step only needs warm water, I used my aluminum dye pot and worked outside. I dissolved 2 teaspoons of the aluminum acetate in 2 cups of warm water, and filled the pot with about a foot of warm water for the test fabric. I then added the still wet fabric and stirred it around. This sat overnight. Back inside, I poured the dye baths into glass containers, covered them, and let them sit overnight as well to make sure I got as much of the chlorophyll into the water as possible. Okay, believe it or not, the fabric needed one more bath. I emptied the mordant bath and added another foot of warm water. This bath was chalk or calcium carbonate, which is an over-the-counter calcium supplement and therefore needs to be ground first. I added the calcium and fabric to the water, stirred it around for a couple minutes. Finally, time to dye. So here are the 3 dye baths. This is grass, parsley, and kale, and they all smell ripe. Whether any of these 3 pots will actually dye fabric, who knows? I have my doubts, but you know what? For science, we're going to continue testing it out. I reheated each dye bath and added the fabric. This needed to be simmered for about 2 hours, stirring at 5-minute intervals. I then let it sit for about 2 additional hours, coming back every now and then to make sure the fabric was still submerged. Okay, I'm gonna wait till the end for the grand reveal, so now it's time for the good stuff. Just kidding, I really like natural dyes most of the time. There are so many chemical dyes to choose from. more than I initially thought. But I'll be using what I think are the 4 most readily available options, starting with this, which I've never used before. So this is a Procion mixed dye in forest green. And this is a fiber reactive dye, meaning that it actually has a chemical reaction that causes it to stick to the fabric fibers. In theory, this should make a deeper, richer color that's less likely to fade. I also like this option because it's a warm water dye, not hot, so less of a carbon footprint in theory. Actually, we should talk about this for a sec. So there are a few sustainability impacts that I think are important to bear in mind when dyeing fabric. As I've mentioned, it takes a lot of water and a lot of energy if that water needs to be heated. But it also creates a lot of pollution in the form of wastewater, which needs to be treated before the water re-enters local waterways. And here we have a bit of a dilemma. I live in a municipal area, as I imagine most of us do, and most muni areas have bio-based wastewater treatments in place, meaning they use enzymes to break down food or potty waste. Most industrial wastewater systems use chemicals to treat chemicals, so it's a completely different system. This one instance, or 4 instances, of me putting chemical dyes down the drain won't totally ruin my city's water system, but I do think that it's important just to keep responsibility in mind when doing this. Okay, down from the soapbox. The very small instructions on the Procion bottle said to add 2 to 3 tablespoons of dye per 3 gallons of water. I halved the recipe because I only dyed 2 tiny swatches. The recipe also calls for salt for a deeper color, so sure, why not? I then stirred for 30 minutes, which is a lot of stirring, and there was plenty more. After 30 minutes of stirring, I gradually added 1/4 cup pre-dissolved soda ash to the mixture over the next 45 minutes. Sorry if I'm spoiling the result, but if anyone out there tries this and the mixture fizzes like this, you did something wrong. Anyway, once the dye time ran out, I rinsed the swatches, washed them, and started the whole process over for the next dye. My second chemical dye was Reliable RIT dye, or probably the most widely available at-home fabric dye. Of all the dyes I tried, the color this one promised was probably the closest to the color I wanted. I chose the powdered form of the dye, which meant I first needed to dissolve the powder in hot water. Again, I used half the packet because small swatches. RIT also requires salt to be added, and a teaspoon of dish detergent? Not sure, not asking. The heat needed to be as hot as the fabric allowed, so up she went. Swirly, 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 45 minutes, you get it. Next I tried this Drylon dye, which was another new one for me. This brand had a more limited color selection, so I chose Tropical Green. Kind of knew this one wasn't going to be what I wanted, but I thought I'd try anyway. This dye also required the powder to be dissolved first, then salt, no dish detergent this time though, and high heat. Lastly, I tried iDye. iDye comes from the Jacquard company, which also makes the Procion dye, and they have a good selection of pre-processed natural dye as well. Jacquard dyes, and iDye in particular, are the dyes I'm most familiar with, but the closest color they had was emerald green. You know the drill by now. Heat, dye, salt, stir. Okay, so here's what we got after all of that. Obviously none of the natural dyes quite got there. This is parsley, grass, and I guess kale is the closest. I don't know, looks like baby poop to me. This is the Procion dye. I think maybe the water was too hot on this one, which is why it's like blue. I think that the yellow component of it didn't actually stick. What I do like about it is that the color is nice and deep and even. There's hardly any streaking on this one, which is awesome. Next is the RIT dye. It's nice and green and dark. There's actually like some yellow streaking in here. This is the Drylon. Maybe I did something wrong with this. Maybe I didn't. Very, very light, and there's a ton of streaking in this one. You can see all of these little streaks. This is the iDye, and it's pretty good, I would say. Nice deep color, little streaking, but nothing too bad. What we got for all of our efforts. A lot of variation here. For the sake of true science, I actually did a full nice comparison between all of them using a few different factors. So here are all of the dyes. There's natural, Procion, Drylon, which I think is actually Dylon, maybe I'm saying that wrong, RIT, and iDye. And then these are all of the different things that I use to rank them. H2O use, heat, number of steps, time it took, color availability, streakiness, and deepness of color. And then I just rank them from 1 to 5, and then obviously if there was a tie, then yeah. And this is kind of where things ended up just on this particular project. There was definitely a lot of user error here, but just, for the sake of this experiment, I do still have quite a bit of fabric to dye, so thinking about which of these options I should choose, obviously it's not going to be the natural dye. There's a lot of green fabric out there from before chemical dyes were created, so they did it somehow. These were my 3 top ranking options. I really like that this one doesn't use as much heat. Nothing about this is necessarily sustainable, but making better choices where available. Number 1, I'm going to try dyeing this at a much lower heat. Number 2, I'm going to try adding some yellow into the mix to see if I can kind of even this out and get green. The Procion recipe I used for dyeing all 8 shirts was 5 bottles of forest green and 1 bottle of lemon yellow dye. This time I dyed at tap temperature. No fizzing, so that's a good sign. I'm pretty happy with the final fabric color, and the deep green matches my skin tone fairly well. It's different than the original, but it's my version. If you enjoyed this experiment, I always appreciate a thumbs up. And if you'd like to join me in my attempts to turn undershirts into a couture gown, hit subscribe. Bye!